Host Dan Dotson. Cybersecurity policy and the public's general understanding of cybersecurity are very important topics when it comes to protecting patients. At the center of this discussion is Jen Ellis. She's the founder of NextGen Security, has testified before U.S. Congress, spoken at numerous cybersecurity events across the world. Jen, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dan. Thank you for having me on.
So excited to have you on today. I'm first interested to kind of understand what got you into cybersecurity and how did you get interested in this journey?
I had a comms background, and I worked in all sorts of different types of B2B tech doing comms. And I think the thing about security that really interested me is this idea that we've crossed a line on innovation where innovation drives societal development. And in all fairness, innovation has always driven societal development. When we first discovered fire, it shifted us into a new phase as humans. When we discovered the ability to store food, we were suddenly able to create urbanization. So it's always had that impact, that shaping of society. But I feel like since the Industrial Revolution, it's really accelerated to a point where now we kind of innovate for innovation's sake. And it's less driven about need often, and it's more about what can we do? And I think that security sits at that point, right? It's like the sort of nasty byproduct that comes out. And so never is this more key than when you're looking at healthcare. And you can see really great innovation in healthcare that actually was designed to really respond to problems. But then in comes this back end issue of now we're exposing people to a type of risk they weren't exposed to before. And so that's the kind of why I got into cybersecurity is I'm really interested in that sort of that idea.
Yeah, no, it certainly plays out for sure. I mean, we see so many organizations advancing their strategy or innovating, to your point, and then, a fast follow or never thought of could be cybersecurity in some instances. As you've been in this space, what are some of the things that you've seen organizations or governments think through to help combat some of that and raise awareness?
I mean, there's a lot, right? I think governments around the world are pretty active on cybersecurity now. They're paying a lot of attention. They're very active on AI. They've gone through their phases of being active on privacy, online harms, etc. So I think there's a lot of different areas where we're seeing them pay attention and get engaged. And with healthcare, that has been, again, it's run that gamut, right? It's gone from being very privacy centric to begin with, looking at the use or the access to health data, making sure that people were aware if issues happened and that their health data was accessed. And then we kind of went through connected medical devices and what the potential is there. I heard about somebody who was working on a project to look at how devices are handled during the autopsy process, because previously there was no standard for that. And actually that means that really we don't look at whether a device could have played a role in death. And so having a clearly defined process for how devices are handled and then investigated could end up being really important. So I think there's all sorts of different aspects of how we think about policy in the cyber realm, and particularly as relates to healthcare.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I think is really important is it starts with privacy. And I think a lot of people are obviously concerned about their personal health information being exposed.
Yeah.
But also on the other side of that coin, exactly. I mean, so many people have had their information exposed, right? Yeah. And so now we're seeing these cyber events lead to large clinical outages, right? Which is impacting care.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so we've seen this paradigm shift to thinking about cybersecurity through the patient safety lens, and thinking about how do we keep these organizations up during an attack versus not being able to provide care. How have you seen some of the things unfold in that area?
Well, I mean, we have seen large-scale cyber attacks against hospitals and healthcare providers. And during the pandemic, it was really, really rife. And I think when you see it and you're facing a global pandemic, it is quite chilling, right? It does kind of reframe how you think of it. You don't just think of it as just another cyber attack, just another day in the office. You think of it as this is a national security threat. right? Like we are talking about loss of life. And I know that people think that sounds very dramatic, but the Synovis attack in the UK last year, which was against a testing company, even though they're not a hospital directly, right? They're a testing company. The knock-on impact to hospitals resulted in mass disruption, and it actually has been it has been given sort of attribution of a death now. And I remember I was a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, the Institute for Security and Technology's Ransomware Task Force, which published recommendations for governments in 2021. That task force was pulled together specifically because during 2020, we had all watched these attacks against hospitals and had gone, okay, there has to be a government response at this stage. Like, this is not business as usual. So we got a whole bunch of people together, like 100 or so people together from all around the world and from all different sort of aspects of the ransomware ecosystem, although that makes it sound like we all engage in actual ransomware attacks, the ransomware defense and recovery ecosystem. And we came up with a set of recommendations for policymakers. So 46 recommendations, I think, looking at deterrence and disruption of ransomware attacks, and then how governments can help organizations prepare and respond at scale, right? That was the basic. And one of the things that we talked about during the process is like, should we ban ransom payments? And we kind of went back and forth as a group, and it was hard to kind of come to an agreement. And so after the report got published, I remember very clearly that so we published the report on April 29th, 2021. May 6th or 7th, I think 6th, was the Colonial Pipeline attack. You may recall that the HSE attack was like a week or two after that. The HSE attack basically closed hospitals across the entire of Ireland. A country's hospitals closed, which is bananas. And we might say it's only a small country. A country's hospitals closed. It's crazy. So the reason I tell the story is, as I say, like we had debated about the ransom payments issue. And after the Colonial and HSE attacks happened, a group of us were asked to do a debate on media on whether the payment should be banned. So we went and we did the debate and everything. And as often happens, the debate then moved on to social media. And there were lots of people from the security industry who were sort of like very clear, like, hey, we have to just take away the motive for these attacks. If we stop them getting paid, they won't do it anymore. And that's the basic rationale, right? It's like you ban payments, the attackers no longer have a reason to mount their attacks. That sounds like really like a great world to live in. Like, it's as simple as that. And I don't live in that world, unfortunately. I live in a world where it's really unlikely they're going to be like, McDonald's it is for me for employment now. I think it's much more likely that they will just escalate to test the metal, or they'll go into other areas. But that's a debate for another time. The point is, we were all on social media and we were all kind of self-congratulatory and, oh, don't we know best? And somebody popped up and said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but they said, what's wrong with you people? And it turned out that they were the parent of a child with cancer in Ireland. A child with cancer that was not getting treatment because the hospitals were closed. And what they said to us was that they were investigating remortgaging their home so that they could offer to help pay the ransom. I get really emotional even now talking about it. And it's like been 4 years. It's ridiculous. But like, I think that's what we lose sometimes, is like we sit in these ivory towers, and it's not that we're disconnected, because we're all working on ransomware response. So we see it firsthand. But we don't always think about like the end individuals who are being impacted by these things and what it means to them and how scary it is for them and how overwhelming it is for them. And that parent who, like, I really hope their child has come through it and is okay now, but that parent did such a good job of reminding me of what's at stake here and why it matters, and why healthcare in particular is a completely different kettle of fish to the way that we think about anything else. Because you are dealing with patients, you're dealing with that potential loss of life. And like, nothing else is on that spectrum in that same way. I mean, not really. Like, there are things that indirectly are, for sure. And I'm not saying that other forms of critical infrastructure aren't important. We should definitely be looking at water and energy, etc. But healthcare, that was a really important reminder for me.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Jen. And those stories unfortunately happen all the time. And it's crazy that the stakes in healthcare are so high, because at the end of the day, there's a patient that we have to provide care to, and that's what we're focused on. And I get that question all the time. Do I pay? Do I not pay? And there is no simple answer. I am curious though. So you all, this task force came out with some recommendations. That was in 2021. We're now here in 2025. Were those adopted? How did that process unfold?
So many of them, yeah. So actually, because this is a terrible thing to say, but in some ways, we got quite lucky with the timing. And I did spend some of that year telling people, like, we were not behind the Colonial Pipeline attack. The timing was just convenient. Because of that, like, I don't know if you remember this, but Colonial, we had President Biden on the news talking about ransomware. It's a weird, surreal moment when the president of the United States says the word ransomware on the news. And so there was this really galvanized response, right? There was a huge level of engagement. And as a result, I think the recommendations got a lot of focus. And now we're in a situation where governments around the world have formed the Counter Ransomware Initiative, the CRI, which has something like 60 odd governments in it now, I think. And they're looking at how they kind of mount a coordinated response. But actually, we saw a lot of the recommendations taken up. So, like, sanctions were taken up, much tighter restrictions on cryptocurrencies was taken up, a lot more around coordinated disruption activities. So, like, one of the things we'd said is, hey, there needs to be a really senior government, whole of government response. We definitely saw that in the US, for sure, and in many other countries as well. We also said, like, governments need to be working together, which they are. We've seen, if you think about the Lockbit takedown, for example, that is a great example of a really phenomenal collaboration between many different law enforcement agencies around the world. And it did have a profound impact. Nothing is going to be a silver bullet. How many times do we say that in security? There are no silver bullets. And that's true here too. So there's no one thing. It's not like, it's whack-a-mole. So it's not like you take out Lockbit and ransomware goes away, but you're making it more expensive. You're making it harder. You're making them have to work for it more. And that's what we should be doing all the time. So there are a number of things that were recommended that have been adopted by governments. I think it's really hard to kind of speak to what the impact of them is, partly because we don't have great data, and partly because I think the technology race is slightly against us here, right? Like, the rise of AI is dropping any barriers to entry that existed before, which didn't, let's be honest, because it's such a vibrant marketplace and you could go in and buy the capability that you may not be able to build. But now with AI, you don't even need to do that. Like, with AI, it's so straightforward. And so, it's just they're shooting fish in a barrel, to be honest. And why would they not? They're making so much money from it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I appreciate you sharing that, because I think, talk to lots of healthcare organizations in my day job, so to speak, and they don't really feel like a lot has been done, right? Yeah. I mean, and at the public policy level, right? Yeah. I mean, there's, in the US, there's been this long conversation around, creating a framework of minimal standards. Senator Warner has really done a good job, at least at the kind of middle to end of the Biden administration, championing some of that. But, part of the challenge for us in the US is we operate on grocery store margin budgets, right? So like every dollar that's moved to cyber is a dollar away from the bedside. It is whack-a-mole. We have limited dollars. And so kind of an incentive program, a carrot and stick. I mean, nothing's really materialized.
Yeah. And we talked about this a lot. So the pillar that I co-chaired was the prepare pillar. And this is a real exercise in, like, be careful in expressing your opinions too strongly. Because when the task force was first floated, I was like, but everybody's published recommendations on what you should do. Why are we going to be different? And the people putting it together at IST were like, well, one, our recommendations are aimed at policymakers, not at CISOs. And two, hey, don't you think it's a really interesting problem to figure out why, if everyone's published recommendations, we don't yet have adoption of those recommendations? So for Prepare, we tried to look at what the impacts were there. And like, it's not rocket science. We know why people aren't adopting, right? We know it's a lack of available resources or a lack of understanding of the problem. It's one of those two things. Sometimes it's both of those things. And, you know, if you look at a country like the UK, we're a 99% small to mediums economy. In the US, it's 44%, but a lot of hospitals fit into that bucket, particularly if you're looking at community hospitals, right? If you're looking at sort of like, you know, the lower end, the long tail, rather than the big firms, they just don't have the resources. They have they have a regulatory requirement to have somebody with a CISO title. Quite often, that's a hospital administrator or an RN that's been given that title, and it doesn't mean that they actually like have any authority or any budget or are actually able to put change in place. One of the things that we were told is that even if the government was to try and give them the carrot and say, here is incentives to go do this thing, like we're going to give you funding, they said like funding will get diverted to other things. It won't get used for this, because the reality is those hospitals need so much help. And we've seen them closing, right? We've seen a lot of them closing or being bought, and which I think is a huge problem. I mean, I don't live in the US anymore, but I think for people who are in rural communities, that's a really big problem. In the UK, obviously we have the NHS, and they also are hugely resource constrained, and they're under a lot of really public scrutiny about whether or not they're spending money in the right areas and what the delays are on treatment. And so I think, and I will say, one of the problems I think we face in the NHS that probably is also true of like those hospitals that are in the lower end, who are independent, who are not part of the big entities, is they don't have buying authority to demand better from their vendors. And NHS, I always look at the NHS and I'm like, please buy together. Like if you operated as one NHS, just think of the authority you would have then. But they struggle to do that because they want their own individual I guess supremacy is the wrong word, but their own individual rights, their own individual jurisdiction, right, for their own area. And I get that, but I also think they're missing a trick, frankly. So yeah, I think it is really tough. I really do.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're the first person I've talked to that brought up a good point, which is, if we gave you funds, would you actually spend it on cybersecurity?
And I wanted them to, right? I was like, we will make the government give you money. I don't know how I thought we would do that, but that was like the whole. And then we had people, because we interviewed so many people, and they were like, that money will get diverted elsewhere. Because as you said, how do you justify not spending money on patient care, right? And I remember very clearly, like the first time I ever met with the FDA. And I want to give like a special shout out, because the team that works on connected medical devices at the FDA are freaking amazing, and I absolutely love them. And so a big heart out to my friend Dr. Suzanne Schwartz, who's done a really incredible job and shown incredible leadership. But the first time I ever met with them, we were talking about harm, right? And we were talking about risk. And I sit in a cybersecurity world. And what do we mean when we think about harm? We talk about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Turns out they were talking about loss of life. That is quite a big delta to have in your conversation, right? Like, here I am talking about loss of data, and you're talking about loss of life. So I think like understanding, like making that shift around what you're really talking about, and kind of getting that common language and figuring out where those gaps are in expectation. But again, like, how are you going to, if you're a hospital, how are you going to defend spending money on network security for a problem that might happen in the future, when you've got problems right now with, machines that don't work anymore, or not enough beds, or not enough nurses, not being able to afford that doctor because they got a better offer somewhere else. If you're facing those problems today and people are not getting the healthcare they need today, it's very hard to invest in a what if scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what recommendations would you have for someone that finds himself in that situation?
I think it's so tough. I can tell you this. Um, it, in previous years, when I worked for a much larger organization, we would have a customer event every year, and I would always volunteer to run the healthcare sort of peer session, right? Because again, really love this sector, very interested in the problems they're facing. And it was interesting actually because the problems didn't really change very much year after year. But what would happen is I would go into the room and I'd be like, hey, so who was subject to a ransomware attack this year? And very slowly and cautiously, every hand in the room would go up. Every hand, which is crazy. And like every year, they would talk about the challenges they had with patient records and with interoperability and with legacy and with not being able to patch and with not being able to get buy in from the organization. And I don't know, honestly, as somebody who's working inside a hospital, how you change that. Because I think, like, if your leadership is buried under problems and they're getting it from every single department, every department is like, my problem is the most urgent problem. I don't know how you reasonably stand out. I don't even know that you should stand out because every problem is a serious problem. So I think it actually has to come from outside. It has to come from the government or from sector leaders, trade associations. It has to come from outside experts going, trusted, by the way, either trusted or authoritarian, outside experts saying, hey, we need to change the calculus here. What do we do? And here's why. Like, they have to actually like show what the end result is. I think having cases like the Synovis case is really important because now we have that record to say, these hospitals closed and somebody died. And like, I think there was a paper that CISA put out that showed that that the impact of cyber attacks during the pandemic created a stress situation that was so much worse for what was already going on, and that also led to loss of life, right? And there was that, there was a case in Germany, and so like there are a number of different cases that people have talked about. I think we have to keep leaning in on those. But again, if I'm a hospital administrator, every problem that's brought to me is brought to me with a tagline of equals loss of life, because that's what harm means to us. So how do I prioritize this category of loss of life to that category of loss of life? And that's where I think it has to be more stick than carrot, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, I think my experience in U.S. healthcare would be that there are kind of three things that move capital. Patients, revenue, and regulation.
Yeah.
And depending on what room you're sitting or where the hospital's at in their life cycle,
yeah,
I can't tell you which one's the top priority.
Yeah.
But as it relates to the capital allocation, I think people are largely beginning to understand, we're probably in the early innings of this can really impact patients, right? I mean, I think this whole notion of like cyber is a patient safety issue, I think people are coming around to that. It's more broader in the C-suite. Boards are talking about it.
Yeah.
The regulation is fuzzy at best, right? The policies, the requirements, and that kind of stuff.
I mean, like I said, you have to have a CISO, so now it's a nurse or an administrator. Like that's not useful regulation.
Correct. And it sounds like I might share a little bit of your opinion. There was this thought of, at least in the US, of creating a new like set of policies or set of framework to assess yourself against. I'm like, guys, there's a lot of framework assessments out there that are good, right? Like, let's not spend all of our energy creating a net new framework just for healthcare when you have, CSF out there and other standards that you can go on to.
Here's the thing, right? If you want to create a framework, like create a framework, but it's got to be the one framework to rule them all, because otherwise what's the point? This is the XKCD thing, right? Like we've all seen this. They're like, hey, we've got 15 different standards. We should create one that's like definitive. And then the next pane is we have 16 different standards, right? So like it has to have an ability to replace them. But the only way that happens is if you have a plan for adoption. And this is like, people who know me will tell you I'm very boring on this topic. Here's the thing. You can build the best thing in the world, whether it's a standards framework or whether it's like the best piece of AI technology or whether it's, I don't know, a new pen, right? If you have no plan for adoption, you just wasted your time. You need not have spent that time. It doesn't matter that it's the best thing in the world. No one will ever know about it. And that's the real problem here is we've got no plan for adoption. We have no plan how to actually look at the core issues that are that are occurring in healthcare that are blocking adoption and going to them, okay, this is how we're going to address those and taking them apart, right? So actually, as you said, the frameworks we have are perfectly good. They work for lots of people who use them and they've existed for a long time. What we need to do is figure out how to make them work for the hospitals and how to help them adopt them. And part of that is there's a sense of overwhelm here, right? I go into online and I Google what I should do and I get millions of results back. This is one of the things we heard in the RTF. We had people say to us, there are, I think when I did it, there was something like 50 million return results of how should I protect myself against ransomware? And people were like, and here's what they would do. This is great, right? So you get 50 million results. And what pretty much all of them say is, you're going to do email filtering, you're going to have online backups, you're going to do patching, you're going to do security awareness training, and you're going to do identity and access management. 5 handy things. And they make it sound like on Monday, you'll do email filtering. On Tuesday, you'll roll out your patching. On Wednesday, let's do some identity and access management. It's going to be a busy week, but the next week will be a cakewalk. That's not reality. And so companies have no idea how to get started. Which one is more important? Is there an order I need to do them in? How long will it take? How much should I be spending? Who should I be looking at? Where do I get started for my organization and my size? And the other thing is we never treat it as if it's a maturity journey. We treat it as if it's this. You do these things right now. That's it. And so I just think we're making it so hard for organizations. If you're not above that security poverty line and you don't have a 300 or 3,000 person security team and you're not oozing sophistication and maturity about security, we make it incredibly hard for you to even get started.
Yeah. So, at the policy level, how would we make it easier? Because I agree with you. I think that's a great way to think about it.
So, I do think there's some element here of holding vendors a little bit more accountable, which I think we've seen some good work on. So again, back to my team of FDA connected medical device people who've put in really good pre and post market guidance for connected medical devices, and I give them huge props for that. And I think that is something, right? And I would like to see that more broadly is the idea of the technology that we buy should be reliable and secure. So I think that is one thing that policymakers can do. I think there's this huge, huge, huge problem around legacy tech. Oof, I don't know how we solve that in any sector, let alone the healthcare sector where the resources are so constrained. I do think there needs to be a lot more close exploration done in these communities. And here's the thing, and this is true for all policymakers, not just those looking at healthcare. Please stop just listening to the people who can afford to lobby. I have no problem with you listening to them. They are completely valid people and they have a point of view. But they are also way above the poverty line. You know how I know? Because they can afford to spend time talking to you. Go talk to the other people. Talk to the people at the long tail, the far end of the market. Because their reality is totally different. And if all you ever do is make policy decisions aimed at those who can afford to come to DC and spend a whole bunch of time talking to you, you will never address the problem because they're not the people who are suffering with no resources or capability or knowledge or understanding. So that would be one thing I would say is go talk to people where they live. Go to these hospitals, see what conditions look like, understand what the problems are. And talk to the vendors about how they can make it easier. One of the things that we used to hear about all the time is that hospitals couldn't patch because patching revolved around taking systems offline, right? Rebooting systems. So a lot of vendors have actually listened to that and they've tried to make it so that patching and updating doesn't require that. That is a thing that we could be pushing further and looking for more. And yes, there are always exceptions where it's not possible, but starting to kind of get into some of that stuff and also not focusing on stuff that frankly doesn't matter and isn't realistic. If you keep telling people don't write down passwords, they're going to stop listening to you. That's not how hospitals are run. And frankly, if I'm a very busy nurse or doctor on a ward And my choice is to like risk somebody having access to that computer that's right there with a million eyes on it, or to risk not being able to get access to the information in time to do what I need to do to help my patient. Clearly, I'm going to be like, you know what, that thing can stay unlocked, or I'm going to write down the password, right? That's just the reality. So we have to focus on the stuff that actually matters. And it's not that privacy doesn't matter, but let's be honest, the average citizen is actually fairly lax about how much they care about their privacy. And they care a lot more about dying. Go figure. So I think like again, just it's going into the environments, understanding how these environments work in detail, seeing it in practice. One of the things that I have really loved is what the CyberMed folks have done, the University of San Diego people, where they have run these like live practices, and and half the physicians don't know that there's a cyber element. I think stuff like that is really awesome. We need better data. We need policymakers to be using that better data. And then I think they can come to better decisions. I'm sorry that I don't have all the answers. If I did, I'd have already offered them to all the policymakers, and hopefully they would be doing them. But these problems are really hard.
Yeah. Do you think we've made progress since you've been on this journey at the policy level? I mean, you pointed out some good, I guess, wins or areas that have made improvement. But by and large, I mean, do you think we're better off?
I think it's slow. And I would say perhaps more, and I know my accent will make it sound like I'm terribly biased here, but perhaps more in other countries. Like I think the EU is really active, and we have to run it through to see what happens. But like the changes they've made around NIS2 and around the CRA coming in, I think could have impact in the long term. I think the idea of liability can have impact in the long term. So I do think that is interesting. I think that there's more to be done for sure. I think in the US, again, like the Patch Act, does give authority to the FDA to act and hold vendors accountable, which I think is important. But I don't think that we've done enough to look at like HIPAA and really see whether it's fit for purpose and if it's like being useful. And I think, there's probably more that can be done there. But it's hard to move policy forward and get Congress to agree on stuff. It's as we know right now.
Yes, at the time of this recording, we are all abundantly aware of the lack of Congress getting on the same page for sure.
Yeah.
No, that's promising. I think because like one of the things I think about like with the Patch Act, for example, lots of elements to it, but there are a ton of legacy devices that are already present that no hospital CFO is going to replace if it's working clinically, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the long tail impact of that. But also if I look at the adversary, like the number one attack vector is not coming through medical devices.
No.
Right.
And that's the thing, right? Is that is the reality, is that people are cynical, and deservedly so, about a lot of the medical device stuff because they think, well, really like it feels a bit science fiction, right? So like we did a disclosure once on an insulin pump, and while the attack was fairly trivial, you had to be within a certain distance, right? So it's a really targeted attack. It's not a wide scale attack, right? And so like people are not sure how worried to be. I think there's a couple of things I would say is, for sure, we should be doing more looking at all forms of technology. And, again, the CRA does that. It is very broad. And I think that we will see more drive towards secure by design adoption and more drive towards liability to hold people accountable to that. So that will relate to business software and imaging, and it doesn't, just affect connected devices. The other thing I'll say is these attacks that we see, like, the reason we don't see attacks around medical devices today, some of it is because of what I just described, where you have to be in the vicinity and whatever, and it's not going to be wide scale. But probably there are other areas of connected devices where you could go wide scale. The thing is, though, you sure don't need to right now, right? Like you're narrowing your focus by going after something that is intrinsically in a system that is only used by certain people. Today, what we see is, generally speaking, as many as possible, when they're leveraging vulnerabilities, it's in software that's much more widely used. However, there are exceptions to that, right? So like if your particular goal is specifically to scare people, so that could be a government against government attack. For example, if you were in the middle of a conflict in Russia and Ukraine, or if you were looking at terrorism, or if you wanted to be able to hold people to ransom. Imagine an attack that was about holding people to ransom, and you wanted fear to be a factor in that, right? Like, the more that we close off doors to attackers, the more they will look for new avenues to go down. And we've seen this, right? Because they went from, we're going to disrupt everything. And then we went, aha, online backups. And so they went, okay, well, we're going to steal your data and ransom it back to you. And then people went, we don't believe you're going to delete it, so we're going to stop spending money on that. And they went, okay, we're going back to disruption. But now what we're going to do is we're going to poison your online backups. So like they will keep looking for routes to go through, right? And I think the potential for them to go after medical devices is absolutely there in the future. But right now they don't need to work that hard, and they don't need to make themselves look that evil. That's the other thing. Is like, there's a big difference between I hit a hospital with a widespread attack versus I specifically went after medical technology. It's a very different framing. And when you think about attack groups that sit in safe haven nations, the framing matters on how much their government will give them air cover.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point. And I think, look, I do think that, changing the game on and stopping the bleeding, so to speak, on medical devices and the Patch Act, et cetera, is great. No,
but it's just one thing.
It's just one thing. Exactly. Like, that's my point, is like, that's the challenge. And I loved your framing on that. I mean, look, the adversaries right now largely want monetary gains, right? They want money. That's what they're after. And so they're going to go
to the adversaries, but yes, the primary group of adversaries, shall we say? Better said.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
The most prevalent. We live in interesting times from a diplomatic point of view.
Yes.
And so but the average entity, we don't hear about those attacks so much until Volt Typhoon, and then we heard about it a lot.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. So if you could change one thing at the policy level that would gain adoption, what would you be focused on?
I mean, I don't know. This is a great question, and it's one I kind of go back and forth on. And I would like there to be a hygiene requirement, I think, but it puts a lot of burden on the target organization, and I think we need to help them, right? Like, I think there needs to be more. I mean, I've always liked the secure by design approach because it puts the burden on the vendor, which I think is appropriate. We had a situation in the UK where we did a bunch of research for a code of practice for consumer IoT that was being published. And it was consumers, right? So we surveyed consumers, and overwhelmingly what they said was they have an expectation that if a product is sold in a shop, that it's secure. And when you think about it, of course they have that expectation, right? Like, if somebody comes and says, I'm going to build your house, you don't think, I hope it doesn't fall down. You think they'll presumably know what they're doing and it won't fall down, right? Like, so I find it a little bit bizarre how much we accept failure in our engagement with vendors. So I do find it appropriate that there has been a real policy shift to the idea of secure by design, and that is where we're going. And I love that. The thing I feel, though, is that in policy circles, there's been a real focus on response and not enough on preparation and or prevention. And so I come back to that hygiene thing, but it is problematic for me because I do think that organizations really do struggle with it. But in reality, I don't think that the long tail of smaller organizations, those below the security poverty line, will ever prioritize investment in this unless or until they are required to do so. So there you go.
I agree with you. It goes back to my what moves dollars, right? I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think to take that one step further, they're not going to be able to even consider doing that unless there's some type of funding.
Yeah. Can't you? Well, funding, yes. But I mean, there are other things that organizations are required to do, right? There are types of insurance they're required to have, for example, and they make it work. The cost gets passed on to the consumer, is basically what happens. But I also think, though, there's something here around, I also do think the pricing needs to come down in security. And, if we had, I think, a little bit more competition, when you think about it, we're still a relatively young industry. We're still relatively nascent. We've matured a lot, but we've not been around for that long. And I think we're still also very mired in specific countries. We don't have anywhere near the widespread level of competition that we could have. And so it's still really expensive, and that makes it harder. And all of those vendors largely target, the higher end of the market because that's where they can make a great payday. So yeah, I think we need to think about how we change some of those considerations.
No, that's excellent. Jen, this has been so much fun. What have we not talked about that you want to share?
I don't know.
Anything come to mind?
I don't know that there's too much. I will say, I will say that, just because we talked about the connected medical devices, that I do think that industry has come a long way. And I hope actually, and here's the thing I'll say, and I know I sound like a broken record because I love that team at FTI so much. You should have seen me in the first meeting we had where I learned that they don't actually test everything. And I was so naive about the whole thing. It was ridiculous. And now I look back on it and I laugh at myself quite a lot. But really, in terms of sector regulators, they were pretty far ahead, honestly, of any of the others. And I would say probably around the world that's true too, because I am not really aware of too many other regulators that were as far along as them and as focused on it, right? They were super, super focused on it, and they continued to update and refine. And one, I think that then set a bit of a bar for other regulators in the US, which I think is really great and has been really helpful. And they've actually acted on it, right? So we've seen recalls of medical devices, which is great. But also, and they've worked really closely with the security community and with the device community, which is great. That level of collaboration should be the blueprint of how everybody does it, frankly. And it's really not something that many other regulators follow. So I really do, this is why I have such love for them, is because of this. And I think if you think about the process that the vendors have gone through, they started off being, as you can imagine, very defensive and very desirous of making it all go away, right? Because lawsuits come with this kind of thing. And actually, the journey that they have walked, not out of choice, because they had to, but they have walked that journey and they have made change. And I would say probably, I've got no data whatsoever to back this up, but I suspect that if you look at really narrow focused industries of tech, sectors of tech, that it's possible that the medical device manufacturers might now be ahead of other sectors of tech because they're being forced into doing so. And so I think there's a question there about how we replicate that to other areas, because as you said, connected medical devices is not the only tech in a hospital, right? It's not even the most common tech to get attacked. So we need to see, all the other groups of tech kind of following along as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, that they provided a blueprint that others can at least look to for, and iterate on for their particular areas of responsibility. I think that's a great point. You did mention something that piqued my interest though, which was lawsuits.
Yes.
So policies around, I'm sure as you're familiar, the ambulance chasers are here, the class action lawsuits are here, which has second and third level impacts on information sharing, right? Yes. So how do you feel about that, right?
It's funny that you bring this up, because there was a LinkedIn conversation about this week, and I was on a bit of a. So You may have heard that in the UK we had large-scale ransomware attacks against the retail sector this year, M&S and the Co-op both being affected. And now we're seeing ads popping up on, like, I mean, I'm told they're on TikTok, but you can imagine I don't really look at TikTok a huge amount. One, because I'm 1,000 years old, and two, because I work in security. But they're all over the place, including on LinkedIn now, and they are advertising class action lawsuits. And if you've been harmed by, and let's be honest now, what are we talking about when we say harm in this sense? What are we talking about? I genuinely no idea what we mean. And so what is likely to happen, though, is that lawsuits like this will encourage organizations not to disclose. Because and I get it that with a ransomware attack, sometimes it's hard not to disclose, because when you've got disruption, you've got disruption. And now then what we'll see attackers factor that in, right? They'll start factoring that into their demand of, like, we'll go public unless you pay us. So I think it's a massive own goal. I think it's a bunch of people with their hands out for no reason. I get shirty talking about it, and I shouldn't. But here's the thing I will say is, if there are people who've experienced genuine harm, then I would love to hear about it. And much like the situation with the HSE breach, I am open to changing my mind. Please come and talk to me if you have experienced genuine harm from one of those breaches, and I will totally change my perspective on it. But as of right now, I think it stands to do more harm than good.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, and would also love to have those conversations, to your point, with anyone that has had true harm. But from a policy perspective, I mean, if you fundamentally believe that the organization that was attacked is a victim,
yeah,
right, now they're becoming another victim by these class action lawsuits,
yeah,
stirring everything up. I mean, it is, again, to your point, for those that have had massive impacts and harms, I think that's a different maybe set of discussions. But this broad scale class action lawsuits, I think, is just yet another thorn in the side of a victim.
Yeah, I mean, I use the mugging analogy to ransomware a lot, right? The idea that, like, because I think when this is about sort of things like ransom payment bans, right? You wouldn't say to a victim of a mugging, how dare you give them your money, right? Like, and you wouldn't, and and reporting. So reporting is one where I am pro reporting because I want the data, but I also have a challenge with it because, like, saying to the victim of a crime, you have to report, feels not great to me. And so you wouldn't say to the victim of a mugging, you have to report it. You might say, hey, if you don't report it, somebody else will have that happen to them, and you should help the police build an evidence case. But you wouldn't be like, you have to. So it's just, there's something weird there, right? So, like, the idea to me that if somebody like came and mugged me and they stole my purse, and then, like, I don't know, because they did that, somebody else had some, like, very minor knock-on impact, and then that person would be able to come and, like, sue me over it. It's just a bit bizarre, right? It's a little bit like, I've built a botnet, and I've built a botnet by compromising IoT. This is obviously something that happens all the time, right? And so now somebody that gets hacked because of my botnet can then sue the person whose, like, thermostat was part of that bot. Like, it's ridiculous, right? Like, it's the same principle of why didn't you secure your thermostat? But it's ridiculous. And, like, actually you don't victimize the victim in that way. It's not cool. I don't like it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But should there be policy around it, Jen? Like, I agree with you. I don't like it either. But, like, if there's no policy that's preventing these class action lawsuits, should there be?
I don't know. Maybe. This is a question that somebody asked a lawyer, not surprisingly, threw out this question in this LinkedIn thread. And I was like, it's interesting. I mean, I am not a fan of regulation for regulation's sake. And I think you can become burdensome with regulation, and that we have to watch out how much we lean in on, free market stuff. On the other hand, I think maybe if it looks like the harm is outweighing the good. And I mean, I think the thing is, if you do bring in legislation on it, you have to make sure there is recourse for those who are genuinely harmed. And that'll be a thing that'll be interesting to see, right? Is what that looks like. If you can
Are
make
there,
a case.
to your knowledge, I'm not an expert in policy. Is this conversation being had?
I
To your
don't know.
word?
I mean, like I said, I saw this LinkedIn thread and I was like, oh, it's really interesting. And I will hope that this conversation is being had. I think the reality is putting myself in the shoes of policymakers who I talk to a lot. Probably enough that they're wishing they didn't talk to me that much. I think what I would say probably is, well, but this is for the courts to sort out, right? This is why you have discretion of the courts. And in reality, this is why you're supposed to have like a judgment. I mean, that's literally what the word judge means, right? Is there is judgment. So it is down to a class action to try to create an evidentiary basis to say there is a clear example of harm here, and also that there is a clear fault here. And I think if you can't do either of those things, now what happens is obviously that people don't want to have this long drawn out process. So they settle because they decide it's cheaper to, or the insurance firm decides that it's cheaper to. And actually then what happens is you create a precedent that makes it worth people doing this, and an industry springs up and on you go. And I just really hope that won't happen. But I guess like the other side of it is, does the fear of lawsuit galvanize people to invest where they wouldn't have? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah,
You
I
live in
don't
the US,
know.
you tell me.
Yeah,
Right? You
no,
live in the highly litigious US.
yes, yes. Yeah, I would tend to say that the class action lawsuits are already here. I mean, I think
Yeah.
the ambulance chasers are here, right?
Right.
So that dynamic is there. To your last question, though, or last thought, do I think that that's moving the investment needle because of that? No. I mean, I don't think that's a component of the calculus of how much I'm going to spend on cyber,
Right.
protection or prevention. But anyways,
Yeah.
so Jen, as we wrap up, you mentioned that people could reach out to you. How do they find you if they want to talk?
Oh, so on LinkedIn, I am at InfosecGen, all one word, Jen with one N.
Awesome.
That's probably the
Well,
easiest.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for today. This has been fun. Any closing comments that you have?
No, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And I guess as a closing comment, I would just say it's hard, but it really, 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 really matters. And we should do more to figure it out. And those who are connected to the healthcare sector or policymakers generally looking at these issues should be doing a lot more to understand what's going on at that lower end of the market. They should be going to the hospitals, looking at how they work in practice, seeing what the problems are, uncovering the truths of the situation, and stop relying on the information you get just from the people who can afford to give it to you. Their voice is valid too. Absolutely listen to it, but it should not be the only thing you listen to.
I think that's a great place to leave it, Jen. Thank you so much. I'm Dan Dotson, and this is Cyber Survivor.